Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Axis Deer in the Texas Hill Country information session. My name is Daniel Oppenheimer. I am the Land Program Manager at the Hill Country Alliance, and I'm joined this afternoon by Matt Buchholz from Texas Tech University. And today we're here to talk to you a little bit about Axis deer. We will be recording this session, and so if you would like to review it or perhaps share it with a friend, a neighbor, a family member, we will be sharing this through our Hill Country Alliance newsletter, as well as on our social media. I believe Texas Tech University's Department of Natural Resources will be doing the same. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll be sharing the recording with you in the coming days. So I work for the Hill Country Alliance. We are a regional nonprofit organization that works throughout the Central Texas Hill Country to conserve the things that make this the beautiful place we know and love. Our programs focus on issues related to land, water, night skies in our communities. And again, I'm our land program manager, where I get to work with a bunch of great landowners, communities, nonprofits, and agencies on a variety of projects to enhance the health of the Hill Country landscape. And if you'd like to sign up for that newsletter I mentioned before, all you have to do is go to hillcountryalliance.org. You'll see up at the top an opportunity to sign up for our newsletter. It is free, comes out once every few weeks, and covers the conservation news throughout the region, as well as educational opportunities. Sorry, we've got a bit of a lag in the technology. Here we go. So as far as this afternoon, here is the game plan. In a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Matt with Texas Tech. He's going to give an overview of the biology, the behavior, and ecology of Axis deer in the Hill Country. I'll then talk a little bit about our Axis deer control project, which we piloted in Gillespie County starting in 2019 and are scaling up this year, 2021. We'll talk about some research and opportunities for you as land stewards to get involved. And then at the end, we will turn to questions and discussion. Again, we have over 90 people joining us today. And so I ask that each of you please stay muted so that we can all hear the presenters clearly and easily. If you do have questions, please submit them in the chat function of Zoom. I'll be monitoring for those questions. And then as we get towards the end of the session, we'll have time to dive into whatever your questions, thoughts, and reactions are. So again, please submit those in the chat function. And when you have a group this size, we're bound to have some different perspectives and opinions, and that's great. I ask that we all be respectful of folks who may not have the same views as we ourselves do. Before we dive in and I turn things over to Matt, I just wanted to provide a few clarifying considerations. We're here today to really focus specifically on free-range Axis deer, which is to say we are not focusing on what's happening with Axis deer contained behind a high fence. We're not here to vilify Axis deer or other exotic species. Exotics have been in the Hill Country now for quite a while, and they're here and a part of the reality. And the question is, how do we manage them as individuals and perhaps as communities? There's the biology, which Matt will talk about. And then when we shift to management and the control project, that's when we start to get on our different relationships with Axis deer. The more people you talk to about Axis deer, you'll see that for some, that four-legged creature represents an important economic source of income that helps them keep their family ranch intact. For others, feeding that Axis deer or perhaps hunting that Axis deer is one of their key ways to connect to nature. And for others, free range axis deer might be a stressor on their agricultural or wildlife stewardship goals. And so we have very different experiences with and relationships towards axis deer. And so with that, we just want to acknowledge and respect that there are different opinions and perspectives out there. With that, I am going to turn things over to Matt.
Okay.
Matt, if you'd like to share your screen. And while you're doing that, I'll just quickly introduce Matt. Again, Matt Buchholz is a PhD student at Texas Tech University's Department of Natural Resources Management. He's been studying axis deer for a number of years, and we refer to him as the guru of all things axis. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your experience. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. As Daniel said, I'm a PhD student in the Department of Natural Resource Management. I have been studying axis now for about 4.5 years. Should be finishing up my PhD within fall at the latest, hopefully. My advisor's on the line, so we'll hope for that. But during this time, we've learned a lot about them. But I'm going to talk a lot about just general biology, behavior, and ecological impact and what they're doing in the Texas Hill Country, and then bits and pieces about what we've been studying for the last 4 or 5 years. So if we start for just a little bit of history on axis, they were introduced into Texas in 1932. After that, we really don't know too much about their introductions into the state. All we really know is that in 1932, they were introduced into Kerr County. There is conflicting reports over what ranch in Kerr County that was. But for practical purposes, we know that it was Kerr County for the initial introduction. Beyond that, we don't know where these animals were from in their native range, what part of India. We don't know how many. We don't know the sex the sex makeup of the population, the age makeup of those introductions. We really don't know any of that, and we don't know beyond just that first introduction if there was any more and to where they were. But since 1932, there's been a large free-ranging population has developed throughout the Edwards Plateau ecoregion and the Texas Hill Country. One of the great difficulties, though, with axis deer in management is their regulatory status. Behind a high fence, legally they are livestock and they're regulated by Texas Animal Health Commission. Outside of a high fence on free range, they essentially have no legal definition. They are essentially the same as feral pigs, that they really don't fall under wildlife, they don't fall under livestock, and that's because of their being an exotic. And that's how a lot of the exotics in the state are labeled as for regulatory status. So it's difficult to deal with them when you don't really have any kind of regulation that helps to guide management. And really it ends up getting put on individual landowners or groups of landowners to decide how to manage them and what best to do. So there can be some difficulty in this. But as we get into the kind of the biology side of it, they really do differ quite extensively from what we're used to for whitetail. Whitetail, most of them are shot by 5, 6, maybe 7 years old. Previous estimates in lifespan for axis are free range from 9 to 13 years old, and then captive, where you can really control their nutrition and keep them alive pretty well, is 18 to 22. So they live quite a bit longer than what we're used to. We have done some work with a technique called cementum annuli analysis, where you look in the root of the tooth and you can get an accurate age estimate. And we have confirmed does as old as 15 and a buck as old as 10. And I can tell you that that buck, he really showed he had no signs of decline. He was a trophy 34-inch, really good body shape, really good body condition. He was in perfect condition. So he would have lived for quite a bit while longer if he hadn't been shot. For one of the questions we get out of this, and we are actually trying to develop a method to age them quickly in the field like there is for whitetail, is what is the maturity age of bucks? When do when do they get that big trophy antler size, or when are they reproductively dominant? When are they overall mature? And we really don't have a good answer for it. I have a feeling of, I'll talk about this some more, that it's older in axis than it is in whitetail for what we're used to for maturity age, but it can be. We really don't know that for sure yet. But if we jump into the axis deer reproduction, and this is actually what I find to be one of the most fascinating things about axis deer, because it really shows their ability to increase in population very rapidly, and it's quite a bit different than whitetail. They have a reproductive cycle from birth to birth that is as fast as 9 months. So their gestation is approximately 7.5 months. They are actually capable of breeding 1 month after giving birth. That means that they can breed while still lactating. This is a really rare occurrence in any kind of wild species. It happens in domestic species, sheep, goats, it can happen in. Humans, we can do it, but it's a rare condition for a wild species that a female could breed while still lactating, because that both of those events are really energetically expensive. So to be able to do both of them really says that they're in very good condition. While they are capable of breeding 1 month, we suspect that most are probably 4 to 5 months after giving birth, and that keeps more of the 1 year timeline between births. Estrus lasts for about 3 weeks. If they are not impregnated during that time, they will cycle again in 1 to 2 months. So it's again a very, very quick succession of cycling. However, it is thought, just anecdotally from a lot of conversations with people, that the probability of this not being impregnated during their first estrus after birth is very low. Most of the time, I've talked to a lot of people who say that they rarely see a non-pregnant doe. So it's pretty quick. We do know from, again, our cementum annuli, our aging analyses, that pregnancy is possible to at least 13 years old. There's some speculation in the literature out to 15, 16 at least. So they can breed quite a bit longer than even whitetail do, because whitetail usually cut off around 6, 7 if they live that long. One of the more striking things here is they are physiologically capable of breeding as young as 4 months old. So really, while we would consider them still fawn, they can breed. However, most of the reports and literature says that it's probably not until about 13 months that they really have their first pregnancy. But they are actually physiologically capable as young as 4 months old. So it can be very quick. If we jump into bucks, there are 2 major ruts, June and July, and then late January, early February. However, it can go all over the place. If you look at this top photo I have here, these bucks are sparring, and it's kind of cut off, but it's in September. They're fighting it. They're sparring in September, so it's outside of those 2 major ruts. Going off that, there is some actual data that suggests that bucks are capable and will have viability of breeding year round, regardless of antler status. So they have a viable sperm year round, and they can impregnate a doe at any time. If you look at this bottom photo, one of these interesting things that I've seen in trail camera photos. This is two bucks sparring. They're both in velvet. I have not seen this in whitetail. It may just be play. It may just be a very casual thing. But they're actually their heads are down and in a competitive position when they're in velvet. So there may be some support for this year-round viability of breeding. Again, as I mentioned when we're in the lifespan, the reproductive dominance, we really don't know when a buck becomes that dominant buck in the herd. For whitetail, that's usually around 5. My feeling based upon what I've seen is probably around 8 to 9. But that's just kind of anecdotal and more of a feeling than feeling. So, it takes quite a bit longer potentially for them to be the reproductively dominant buck in the area than it would for whitetail. Fawns, there are multiple fawning periods, kind of going off those ruts. So if we look at these 3 separate photos, all have young axes. This top one, February, that fawn is probably about a week old. This guy in September, he's probably 3 to 4 weeks old. And this bottom one is in November, and that one's probably about 2 to 3 days old. So if we trace this back, the top photo is in that February to March fawning period. Middle photo, late July, August fawning. And then this last one's pretty random. It just is in November where, it happened that doe was pregnant and gave birth in November. So it's pretty kind of random. That's for about 5% of the population. Twins are very rare. There's only actually a handful of recorded instances, and most of those, I've only seen 1 recorded for free range. The rest are in zoos. So it's a very rare event. If you see a doe with 2 fawns, most likely what that is that doe has kind of adopted another doe's fawn. Either that second doe got shot or got hit by a car or something. And that's usually the case for twins, that you might see, you might think that there are twins. Fawn survival is thought to be very high, somewhere in the 80 to 90% range. So there's quite a bit of fawn recruitment. Fawns go from a partial green diet, go from all milk to a partial green diet at about 1.5 months old, and this will play kind of a critical here in a minute, and then full wean at about 5 to 6 months old. So if you still, like I said, in a lot of cases, these does are breeding when they still have some lactation happening, still have some milking from the fawn. So it's like I said, it's a rare condition. If we kind of summarize this all up for reproduction, it's a year-round thing. Fawns happen at any time. We get bucks breeding at any time. It gets kind of complicated here. One of the big questions is what triggers estrus and rut for does and bucks. What we kind of think might be happening here is that estrus is really kind of triggered just purely by nutritional status. Is that doe in high enough condition that she can spend the energy to become pregnant, to get pregnant? So that may be purely what drives them. For rut, it might just be simply, is there a doe and estrus nearby? And then that buck finds that doe, he gets ready to mate, and it happens. It may be as simple as that. Whereas in whitetail, this is all really triggered by length of day. So it might be really simple in axis compared to what we've in whitetail, Whereas if that doe has the nutrition, she'll breed, and if that doe is in estrus, that buck will breed. So it can be pretty simple, we think. There is rapid cycling. Given lifespan and the cycling speed, a single doe might have up to 15 or more breeding cycles during her lifetime. So that's a single doe producing potentially 15 fawns. Given high survival rate of fawns, could be 12, maybe 12 surviving. A single doe that lives, up into those advanced ages, she could raise 12 fawns to adulthood. And half of those on average are going to be does. Every one of those fawns has the same, every one of those female fawns has the same ability. So it can, population can grow very rapidly. Give me 1 second while I turn the lights back on. Timing of primary fawning season, again, we think it's related to nutrient availability. Like I said, those animals, the fawns switched to a partial green diet about 1.5 months after birth. So if you think they're being born in probably late February, early March, trace out that to a 1.5 months after that, that's April. That's when we start seeing a lot of the good vegetation coming up in the hill country. So you start seeing high nutrient availability for both the doe to produce milk and for the fawn to start switching to a green vegetation diet. For predation, and this kind of goes off it on how the high fawn survival rate is, it's the general consensus among the biologists is that there's probably very little. The fawns, when they're predated upon, are bobcats, coyotes, and pigs. You can notice here these two photos. This was actually a fawn that I found on the Texas Tech Junction campus. That from indications here, both kind of how the body is left and some tooth marks, it was probably a bobcat. So this was probably, and this is the only kill I've ever found, honestly, in 4.5 years. So it's there could be very little predation. For adults, axis deer are bigger than whitetail. What really is out there that could kill a full grown axis? The rare mountain lion. If coyotes got into packs, maybe, but really it's pretty rare. We think there probably is something happening here called ecology of fear. So I have seen entire herds of axis, 50 to 60 animals, spook on bobcats and coyotes. And the thing is that really any of the adults, especially the bucks, if they tried hard enough, could kill that predator. So they're spooking on them. So what's probably happening is that at some point over the last 80 plus years that they've been here, they've learned that these are predators. And even though it could be rare that they kill an adult, the herd spooks and runs. So really what kills axis in Texas? Bumper and bullet, us. Those are really the two main sources of mortality in axis. Whether someone runs them over, someone shoots them. So really predation is really humans. For disease, again, what kills them? They are considered to be very disease hardy, meaning that not much for disease harms them. They have been confirmed carriers of several diseases. So if we let epizootic hemorrhagic disease and blue tongue disease, those are both diseases of whitetail that we'd be concerned about when they pop up. But it seems that axis really don't die from these, so it's kind of rare. Malignant catarrhal fever, that is a disease of sheep. So a lot of the contact that axis deer have with livestock is with sheep and goats. So MCF is kind of a concern when it happens, not for the axis, but if they could move it to sheep. And we actually have had a strongly suspect case on South Llano State Park where we think that axis, they found a sick axis, and everything that they described to us said it was probably MCF. She ultimately died of getting shot, but she was blind as best as they could figure, so she probably died of starvation. And that's a characteristic of MCF. Brucellosis, bovine TB, and PI3 type 3, those are all cattle diseases. So again, if axes are interacting with cattle, there's some potential concerns. The really big question here, and acknowledge it, is chronic wasting disease. We've been looking into it. We've been advancing our research, but that's really all I can say on that at this point. We should have some other stuff in the future for it. Herding behavior, I'm sure, anyone who's seen axis knows that they herd, knows that it can get up to several hundred animals. And I've seen herds of, the largest herd I ever saw was about 300 plus. It was probably 300 plus, but I've heard of 500-600 in a herd. So these herds can get very large. There is a mixture of sex and age classes in these herds. You really don't see, in these huge herds, you don't see just at all bucks or all those. There's a mixture, and it varies from ages. You will see some smaller groups of bucks periodically throughout the year, but because they will disperse following breeding. But really, these large herds that you'd see, they break and form constantly. They are fluid. They have very little cohesion in these very large groups. They, based upon some work that we've done, and I'll talk about it later with spotlighting and estimating population, these large herds are not found at night. They break down after the evening feeding. You get the smaller groups that go out, and then they come back together for feeding during the day. So there is constant breaking and form, animals leaving, animals coming to the herd. So it's a very little cohesion as a whole. One of the questions that we have that I've heard from a lot of people too is what are the effects of harvest on these large herds? So say you take out the dominant buck, or you take out a matriarchal doe. What happens to these? Do they form and then not come back together? And do they break and not come back together? It's a question that might need to be addressed. It's from what we've seen and what I've talked about with people, if you take out the dominant buck, the herd seems to kind of fall apart, and may not come together in the large groups like you've seen previously. So there's kind of a question here about what happens with effects of harvest. Socially, as I said, the large herds are very disjointed. They do not have a lot of cohesion between each other and break and form. The only really long-term associations that axis steer seem to have is a family unit. So you've got a doe, her previous fawn, and maybe her current fawn. And that's really the only long-term association. That's what we were seeing at night when we were spotlighting. You might see a doe, and a younger female that was probably her previous fawn, and then these current fawns, and that's kind of how you get these family units developing. When you do get these large herds, it appears to have a matriarchal doe in charge. She kind of determines where the herd goes. If she spooks, the herd spooks. So kind of you got that matriarch in charge. However, the dominant buck is still there. He's very aware, and obviously from hormones is very, kind of persistent. But and I tell this to people, if you want to shoot a dominant buck in an axis herd, you want to shoot the big buck, spook the herd, because he will stand and stare at you for probably 15 seconds after you spook the rest of the herd. That's what happened with this guy here. I spooked the rest of the herd, and he just stood there and stared at me. So he's trying to show his dominance to the herd and to me. So that dominant buck is kind of maintaining himself at the back of the herd and watching over potentially for any threat. In this case, it was me. But really, when you look into this, if we look at the classic definition of a harem, and that's kind of best shown by elk, where you get a bull that keeps his group of cows, and he doesn't let any other bulls nearby, and he fights them off for his cows. If you look at that kind of definition, Axis Deer really don't maintain a harem like that. The bucks seek out receptive does. They allow other bucks nearby, and they're for the most part non-territorial. They will move. They move and they seek out wherever they can find a receptive doe. They're not going to maintain that single area with his cows like you would see in elk. So that's really how we deem that they probably do not maintain true harem. For habitat preference, they really do need a riparian habitat, and they need water at least once per day. That riparian habitat, based upon what we've seen, is consistently grassland and shrubland mix. So it's a food source, both grass and shrubs, with available cover nearby. So that's where they're kind of providing themselves really everything they need: food, water, cover, in those riparian grassland and shrublands. They also like bottomland forests, so a lot of those pecan forests, live oak forests are pretty common. They generally avoid rocky terrain if they can. So they kind of avoid those higher points on the hill country, especially with those higher points are mostly juniper. I've seen them eat juniper. They can digest it. Not high on the list, but they try to avoid those areas if they can find somewhere else. For vegetation wise, really everything. To be honest, they are an intermediate mixed feeder. Meaning they consume all vegetation types at all times of the year. So that is from grass, forbs, flowering plants, basically, trees, shrubs, anything they can find, fruit, crops, anything. And really, this is at kind of all times. Their diet consists really of what's available at any point in the year. There's past research out of the Kerr WMA, Mason Mountain WMA, those areas, that says they switch their diet from grass to forbs very regularly, and what proportion is which throughout the year. However, there seems to be really a quality over quantity. So if they can get those good grasses, they will select those over browse. Where whitetail, on the other hand, they cannot digest large portions of grass. Their gut can't do it. So we kind of get into a difficulty here, and I'll talk about it more later, over what that competition in those years where browse goes away. 2011 is a great example. There wasn't a lot of browse after the drought. Whitetail really struggled, whereas Axis just switched to eating grass. So they did very well throughout that period because they could digest a wider selection of vegetation. The kind of their preferred species, some of the examples are Texas wintergrass, buffalo grass, grama, and blue stem species. So you can see here, this is one of our deer exposures that we built to examine what's the effect of Axis on vegetation. On the left is inside, on the right is outside. So you can see quite the difference in those grass species there. That's some wintergrass and buffalo grass and a couple other things mixed in. But that's about the grass inside is about 18 inches tall. Outside, it's about 3 or 4 inches tall. and really doesn't have any seed heads. So the effect of axis on some of these preferred species of grass can be very profound in some areas, and potentially be impacting the progression or succession of habitats. So they can have an effect here. Population size and density estimates vary very widely. Anywhere from, I've seen as low from 6,000 to 125,000. So there's a lot of variation in those. Unknown population parameters, and those what we call primary population parameters are reproduction, mortality, immigration, and emigration. What drives the changes in population size? We really don't know much of these. Like I said, we know some of their reproductive ability. We know kind of some of what kills them. But we really don't know much about immigration or emigration. How does that affect their population size? And then even the specifics of reproduction and mortality. What about age specific values of these? All of these play into how a population grows or shrinks. In this case, it's more likely to grow. But we, to get some of these pieces of information will help in developing management and everything. We did conduct spotlight surveys, as I mentioned. So we started to look at distribution across the landscape, what habitat types were they most dense in, and then also kind of comparing them with whitetail density and abundance. These numbers, again, they're soon to come. I really can't say too much about them right now, but because of how publication works and everything, but they will be out there relatively soon. So I kind of went through some of this, but what's their impacts on vegetation? This is another one of our deer exclosures. This one is actually on, we have since taken them down, but this one was on South Lano State Park in Junction. The foreground is outside the exclosure. The background is inside. So you can see pretty much bare ground outside that exclosure. Whereas inside you have a lot of grasses. There's some frostweed, common horehound, few other things mixed in there that may not be incredibly palatable. But really, there's a number of things that axes do that drive, that could cause bare ground. And this is kind of perpetuated here, and I'll show it. I'll have a video here in a couple minutes about how this might happen. But axis deer do impact the composition of vegetative communities, so potentially removing those native grasses, allowing some invasive grasses to grow. Removal of palatable and nutritional valuable species. So, like I said, winter grass, buffalo grass, grama, blue stem. Those are pretty good quality grasses that things like cattle could be using. But if you've got axis, you might not see it too much because axis are eating it before it ever gets to a reproductive stage. We do suspect that they are preventing or slowing the regeneration of large hardwoods. So those large hardwoods are live oak, pecan, other species of large hardwood trees that, together with high densities of whitetail, they are consuming the shoots, the young saplings and seedlings before they ever get to size, that they're protected from being consumed. And this prevents or slows the regeneration of those species. So if you look around, really in a lot of areas, you don't see young pecans. You only see older pecans. And that's because these deer species are preventing regeneration potentially by consuming young seedlings. So impacts on soil, if we jump to that, trailing, I'm sure you've seen, axis deer have a very heavily trailing behavior, and this could be erosion and compaction, causing erosion and compaction of soil. So if you actually look at this picture I have here, this is a shot of a portion of the Junction Texas Tech campus, where this is from Google Earth imagery, so from satellites. You can see the axis trails spreading out This is a spot that's open in a pile of down mesquite, and they just spread out from there. So these trails are 6 inches deep. A lot of erosion off of them, a lot of compaction preventing any kind of regrowth in these trails. And it's probably a fair amount actually of soil damage that's happening in this. The next part is kind of this removal of stabilizing plants. And like I said, I have a video here that I want you to pay attention to this guy right here, specifically his nose. So if we watch it here, he's just eating. Now it's a little tough to see, so I'll play it again. But again, he pokes his nose through the fence and does something. So if you look closely right here, I'll kind of outline it. What he did is, instead of nipping like whitetail do, where they nip off what they're eating, he pulled. So what he did is he grabbed that clump of grass and he pulled it out by the roots. So this could be affecting the root structure underground, which underground root structure stabilizes soil. So if they're consistently doing this, they could be causing soil to lose that cohesion and contributing to erosion. This is something that's seen in horses. Horses will do this. Cattle nip like whitetail do. But to actually see this in a video is very helpful, because we can actually see exactly that they could be contributing to erosion via the method that they're just by eating. So it can be pretty impactful. Kind of the last slide I have before handing it off to Daniel again here. This is one of the great questions here. Impacts on whitetail. How much do axis and whitetail really honestly compete with each other? It's a debate, to be honest. Browse availability, yes, axis, whitetail are pretty much limited to forbs and shrubs and trees for food. Axis can eat that, but they can also eat a bunch of other stuff. So really, when is that overlap happening, and when are axis hurting whitetail? Really, that probably is happening during years where we have low browse availability, during the drought years. And as everyone kind of knows, drought's becoming more and more consistent. So we might be seeing more of this in the future, where browse just is not as available as widely, and may not have as high of nutrition in it. So there could be some potential impacts on whitetail happening. Competition of deer feeders. We've a couple of these, here's this one's kind of dark, kind of tough to see, but this is an axis buck chasing a whitetail doe off of a pile of corn. So there's some competition here, and usually axis win. They're larger, more aggressive. So really, in these cases, are whitetail being pushed off of deer feeders because of axis being there. Really, on a broad scale, what I think is really happening for impacts of axis on whitetail is, I think it's more of a physical displacement. I think, if you're a single whitetail or a small group of whitetail, and you see a herd of 60, 70, more than 100 axis coming through, and those axis are larger, they're a more aggressive species, they'll get up on their hind legs and kick, you're going to move. So there is some impacts here that might just be physically, axis are displacing whitetail out of those higher quality riparian zones into potentially some lower quality habitat. And that may be what we're potentially be seeing here in the future. So with that, Daniel, I'll hand it back to you for a few minutes.
Sounds good, Matt. All right, and just so you know, your advisor has been hitting home run after home run, answering many of the questions in the chat. So your job will be pretty easy when we get to the questions section. So I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes about the Axis Deer Control Project. Based on the impacts we were seeing here in the Pedernales River Basin, specifically impacts to agriculture, things like cereal and grain crops, native wildlife like whitetail deer, in these riparian areas along our hill country creeks and rivers, we decided in 2019 to kick off this Axis Deer Control Project. And the project really has three goals. Again, we're focused on those free-ranging Axis deer, and we want to first just raise awareness about the impacts. I think most landowners know that if you have a bunch of feral hogs on your property, you're going to have some real impacts, but there's still a lot of people out there you talk to who would love to have a big herd of Axis on their property. And so one thing we're trying to do is just to raise awareness that, you know, these animals, free ranging animals, can and do have some considerable impacts, or can, on the vegetation, on the soil, on the habitat, and so forth. Because they've become such a prolific exotic species in certain parts of the hill country. Think back to the part about fecundity and how a single doe can produce 15 or so fawns. We're trying to encourage people not only to learn a bit more about these impacts, but to start to control some of these free range exotics. And for folks who are willing to step up and to control some of these exotic species, mitigate some of those impacts, we are working with local businesses to incentivize that control and to help with some of Matt's research, which we'll get into in just a moment. So again, we started this project off in 2019 and 2020, and we weren't sure how it would go. No one's ever attempted a project like this. And so we started out pretty small with collaborators such as the Gillespie County AgriLife Extension, Texas Parks and Wildlife, of course, Matt, and Texas Tech's Department of Natural Resource Management. And we just sent out a few press releases to the local newspaper, the Fredericksburg Standard, and the project was received really well. We had calls from not just across Gillespie County, but the hill country and the state, people wanting to learn more about the impacts, as well as frankly where they could harvest and access. And we had over 90 landowners, hunters, and stewards participate in this project, which really exceeded our expectations. So given the amount of interest that this project in Gillespie County generated, we decided this year to scale it up. And so working with a bunch of different collaborators, including extension offices in Gillespie and Blanco counties, again, collaborating with Parks and Wildlife, the Llano River Watershed Alliance, Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District, and the Cibolo Center for Conservation, which was previously the Cibolo Nature Center, we've been able to really widen our net in terms of reaching out to landowners and other stewards to talk about the impacts that Matt's done a great job discussing this afternoon, and to talk about opportunities to help not only reduce the populations of free range Axis, but to help with some of Matt's research as well. And so with that, I'm going to now flip back to Matt. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Matt's going to talk a little bit more about his research. And then we will get to questions. So Matt, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, so as Daniel mentioned, you know, we're involved in this whole project. What we've kind of been asking for in partnership is, working with landowners and hunters and other stewards is a great opportunity to get a lot more samples than we would ever see. So the last year in a pilot project, what we asked for was a muscle sample so we could do some genetics work on them. What we're asking for this year to help with determining age structure of the population, help with developing the aging technique that we're looking into. We're asking people if they can collect a jawbone from axes that they harvest. So it's a relatively easy process. We just kind of want to walk through and show people kind of how easy it can be to kind of guide people and help them get working with the project. So very quickly, the easiest way that I've found to extract your jaw is you make an incision down underneath their chin, basically, down to the point where the jaw kind of bends back up. If you make that incision and then kind of skin back along the jawbone, you can remove all the skin from the jaw pretty easily. And then if you get the tongue out from the jaw by making a couple of incisions here. You can see you've kind of removed the tongue. Once the tongue is removed, you can make some more cuts back in here to kind of remove a lot of this muscle that holds the jaw in. As you know, there is a lot of muscle that holds the jaw in because it needs muscle to chew. So if you make some cuts back there, kind of sliding your knife along the jawbone, you can remove a lot of that muscle. And then once a certain point, you'll be able to kind of bend back the jaw from the rest of the head. And what you can either do, either way is acceptable. You can keep cutting, keep prying until till both sides of the jaw are free, or as long as all the teeth are present, you can break the jaw at kind of the bend in the jaw as it goes back as it would go back into the skull. Either way of those are perfectly acceptable. We can do everything we need with that, even if it's broken. One of the things we do ask is that you do not fully clean the jawbone, meaning you do not remove all the muscle and you do not remove the gums. And this is most commonly done via boiling. We ask that you do not do that because we want the jaw to be in the condition that you would see it in an animal that you just harvested. You can freeze the jaw and label it with hunter name, a contact, some kind of contact info, please. Date harvested, the GPS if you know it, county and nearest road if you do not know it, and the sex. And all of this information will be on news releases. It'll be from Hill Country Alliance on various on their page, on their website. So all of this, if you didn't write it down now or don't remember, it will be in other sources. So, Daniel, is there anything else?
No, that is great, Matt. I'm gonna share my screen one more time. So again, as Matt mentioned, we will be sharing some press releases throughout a big part of the Hill Country and adding these specifics to our website, which again is hillcountryalliance.org. We have our wildlife page is where we highlight the Access Deer Control Project. And so for those who are interested in helping Matt with his research, as he talked about, there's still so much we don't know about free range axis deer. And so this project to collect those lower jaws is a way to really help us understand the age structure, the overall community structure of these free range axis deer. We've worked with a number of partners to identify some drop off locations where hunters, landowners, and other stewards can bring that frozen lower jaw along with the information that Matt has mentioned. We've tried to do a good job of offering a variety of locations geographically. We've got as far west as Kimball and Bandera County, heading east to Gillespie and Blanco, and one location in Comal County. So we hope that if you are hunting axis deer, that you will bring a jaw to one of these spots. And if you are not a hunter, but perhaps have a neighbor, a friend, a family member who is, and they'd be willing to help us with this research undertaking, here are the dates, locations, and times. And we're all just trying to help Matt with his research and enhance our overall understanding of these free range axis deer. So with that, we are going to go into questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can go through the chats. Again, if you have a question, please submit it via chat. I'm going to go back through. It's going to take me just a moment because, again, Matt's professor has done a great job answering the questions about breeding and predators. Here was one, Matt, related to predation. Gary and Kathy found a dead axis that was half grown, too far from a road to be hit by a car. Heart and lungs were eaten, but nothing else touched. Any idea what would have eaten these organs first or killed it?
Not too much off the top of my head without being able to see the carcass. One of the great difficulties in determining what killed something for predation is you usually need the carcass. You need the carcass because there's a couple of telltale signs on how the predator attacks that can determine what killed it. Without knowing too much, so a younger animal, kind of too far from being by the road, and I wouldn't say it's old age. I have had some roadkill that has made it a fairly decent distance from the road. But for heart and lungs being eaten but nothing else touched, that kind of makes me think that it's some kind of scavenger. It's probably not that it died of something that we really can't maybe tell, but then was probably a fair amount of scavenged on.
Yes, they mentioned a long list of scavengers.
Yeah, that would, and it's very difficult to tell, honestly. Like I said, predation, unless you have the carcass, and even when you have the carcass, can be a very difficult thing to determine what. Stupid light here, sorry. But I don't know. I mean, really, it could have had disease. It could have been one of the rare ones that died. It could be, like I said, there is a potential, as coyotes are known in certain circumstances that they will pack, and they will hunt as a pack. It's rare, but it certain circumstances it could happen. They could have taken it down as a pack. I don't know. And it's interesting. I mean, like I said, really on a full grown axis, especially a full grown buck that is approaching 200 plus pounds, in that area, really there isn't much to do it. I mean, where I grew up, in Wisconsin, we had wolves and bears, and they bears are really common to kill fawns. They're the highest predator of fawns in Wisconsin. Wolves take a decent number of whitetail each year. So really, but down there, there's, besides kind of that rare mountain lion that would come through, there's not a large predator. Um, it's kind of difficult to tell. I'm sorry. I can't give you a better answer, but yeah, I don't know.
Matt, when do axes typically shed their antlers?
So they're the summer bucks, so the bucks that are breeding in July and August, they're shedding probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So they've either recently shed or are shedding currently. Probably the latest ones are shedding currently, but they've those summer bucks, which make up like 70-75% of the population, they were shedding in January.
Thanks. Do axis eat non-native invasive KR bluestem? Not to be confused.
I don't know specifically KR bluestem, but we did years ago. We did do some preliminary diet stuff, and really they kind of eat everything. Like I said, we did find some invasive grasses in their fecal and rumen material. So they very well could. I don't know specifically. A lot of the specific, very fine scale, what they eat is kind of unknown, other than observation. A lot of what we do know specifically, like Texas wintergrass, buffalo grass, those, and they're just, you can walk around and see axis eating them. Some of the more specific, there was some studies like said out of the Kerr and Mesa Mountain in the 80s that looked into some of that specifically. But I wouldn't doubt it, to be honest. I have pictures on my phone of axis bites on common horehound, and horehound has very little, if any, nutritional value. And it's kind of the last choice of everything else in the world. So they really do kind of eat everything that's out there.
There's one that I'll take to clarify. Axis deer, although Matt talked about legally how they're categorized as an exotic, you can hunt them year round. You can even hunt them day or night. You do have, however, need a hunting license to shoot an exotic axis deer. But again, yes, you can hunt them year round, but that license is needed. Matt, we have a question from Suzanne with regards to your research. Will you take recent roadkill?
Yes. Recent as in this time of year, about 24 hours, maybe a little bit more. Come summer, I would not. I don't. Daniel would be the expert on how long we are progressing on this for this year. But as temperature increases, time that we would take as it's been dead decreases. Once you start hitting 75, 80 degrees or more, it really is limited to basically that morning.
And Suzanne, I'll just add, please be careful. If you're collecting stuff on the side of the road, please be really, really careful. All right, cruising through again. Your advisor has done a phenomenal job. There's a question about, will this be available? Assuming I have not yet botched the recording, yes, indeed. We will be converting this Zoom video into a YouTube video, and we'll be sharing it through our Hill Country Alliance newsletter, as well as through our social media. I believe Texas Tech University's Department of Natural Resource Management will be sharing it via their social media as well. So those will be the two key ways for either you to watch this presentation again or to share it with friends and family. hillcountryalliance.org is the website. Up top, you'll see a link to sign up for our newsletter. It's free, comes out once every couple of weeks, all the great conservation headlines throughout the region, as well as educational events. We will be, as part of the project, we have posted drop-off dates through the first week or two of March. Matt, how long beyond that timeline, if people wanted to coordinate directly with you after March, how long are you wanting to be?
That might be on a case-by-case basis, and we have your show email. People can get a hold of me on more of a case-by-case basis past March.
Okay. Here's a question. If you want access to hunt, but also protect and keep whitetail, what is a healthy ratio? These landowners have game cams to see and monitor those numbers.
That's kind of on a more, that might be more on an individual basis. What for any given ranch, because of the ability of access to increase their population relatively quickly, and compared to whitetail can kind of stagnate depending upon the year. You might want to keep your whitetail numbers, a decent amount higher than your axis numbers, and that that could be done in more of a consultation. If you're an MLDP program landowner with Parks and Wildlife, maybe ask your biologist what kind of what effect axis, what's your habitat do you have on the ranch? All of this stuff kind of depends on what you could keep your axis numbers at to have a decent amount and significant amount that you can keep it going through the years, not just shoot it and eliminate it from hunting, but also keep your whitetail in healthy condition. So a lot of that kind of depends on what kind of fawn recruitment do you have in whitetail currently? What's your habitat? A lot of that could be very well helped with working with your biologist if you are a MLDP landowner.
Matt, can you talk a little bit about axis predation in their native habitat of India and
tigers? It's tigers. It's a very different circumstance where they're the areas historically, you go back hundreds of years when tigers were fairly prevalent throughout India. That's really what killed them. And then also humans again. But once, even there's some reports actually out of India where with the declining tiger numbers, certain areas are really getting overrun with axis. So really, their major predator over in native is that it's a predator here. Like I said, it's kind of difficult over what really is the main predator, if any, besides humans.
So Matt, with the intention of trying to support your research one more time, I'm putting the drop-off dates and locations up on my screen. Can you remind people what it is that you are looking for?
Yes, so extract the lower jawbone from axis. As I showed before, and we can go back to it in the recording if you're watching this after the fact. But you extract the lower jawbone, keep keep muscle on it minus what you need to cut off to get it free. And don't clean any of it via boiling or any other method. Just extract it, label it with the information that I'm sure will be on other stuff, and put it in a freezer and drop it off at one of these drop-off points when you can.
So with that, we've addressed, I believe, all the questions either your advisor or you have now, I think, addressed. Oh, we have a hand. So given that we have gotten through all the questions in the chat, I'd love to now open it up if folks want to take themselves off of mute. Holly, you have raised your hand. If you would like to take yourself off mute and share your question, we'd love to hear from you. All right, we might have scared Holly off. Let's see. Does anyone have a question that they would like to pose to Matt? I guess I'll offer myself as well, but with Matt in the room, I don't see why you would possibly have a question for me.
And any questions you may have in the future, Daniel has put up my email. Feel free to email me, and I will do my best to answer.
One question we are not able to answer for a variety of reasons is we are not brokers for hunting opportunities, and so we hope people who want to be able to hunt free range axis deer can find those opportunities. We wish you the best, but that is not a question that either Matt or I can help you with. So apologies for that. That's not a question we are able or have the bandwidth to respond to. So sorry, we cannot be more helpful there. Let's see, Rose, yes, we did discuss a little bit about the population. Matt, do you want to talk more, or can you talk more about sort of the scaling out, talking about the population growth?
Yeah, so I got to be stringent here again because of this, how we work our data and how it has to be published. But you know, the axis deer population free range, the estimate varies incredibly widely, from as few as 6,000, which honestly, if anyone even looked out there, you could tell there's more than 6,000. But to the highest estimate I've seen is 125,000. Really, all I can say at this point is those are low, and that's about as much as I can go into currently. There's a lot, and it doesn't take a lot of time driving around to know that there are a lot of axis in the hill country. We did talk a little bit. I've got the chat up here too. We did talk a little bit about whitetail impact on whitetail deer. It'll be in the recording too, but yeah, they do. It's probably more of a physical displacement, moving whitetail to suboptimal habitat, just because of the size of these axis herds. But yeah, there is some impact on whitetail via competition for browse at certain times of the year. Certain years where there's drought, browse is less available.
There's a question which I'll attempt to address at least partially about, we have, as you talked about, Matt, herds that can exceed 1, 2, even 300 animals. If landowners were to become serious about hunting, there's only so much meat that can fit in our freezers. What do we do with all that excess meat? And that's, there are partial answers to that question. There are deer processors that participate in a program. I think it's called Hunters for the Hungry, whereby the state provides them funding such that you, the hunter, do not have to pay for the animal to be processed in order for that meat to then be donated to, say, a food pantry. But there are only so many deer processors who are involved in that program. And so, if you can find a processor that's enrolled in that program, that's great. Otherwise, I think part of it might just be talking with your neighbors and community members about, who needs venison, and just working with your neighbors to share that meat with them, which I know is not the simplest answer, Gary and Kathy, but that's something that I personally have been trying to figure out. And that's the best that I've come up with. We've got several hands raised. Feel free to speak up. Don't be shy. And then Margie, I'm sorry, I didn't actually understand your question. When you say
do you mean,
locals,
if you mean by locals, the kind of animals that the individuals that hang around neighborhood. I don't really study, they're free range. So at a certain point, yes, we are studying them. But they're also under some slightly different situation. They're living potentially off people's plants in their yard. The neighborhood suburban deer. I mean, it's that in kind of the truest sense of what I study. No, I don't particularly study them because what are they? Are they behaving differently? Are they consuming different vegetation compared to the ones that are out there on the ranches or everything? There are some really fascinating studies out there on suburban deer of whitetail, and kind of how they have adapted to human, basically living with humans. But yeah, and I'm sure that they can become a nuisance. I've seen photos out of Bernie where there's literally 60, 70 axis walking down the center of the road. So yeah, I know some of them have certainly become adapted to areas where they are pseudo protected because of being in around people.
Margie, yeah, thanks for the clarification. And Matt, looks like you answered the question beautifully. There was a question about having a drop-off point in Kendall County. We are working with our partner, one of our partners, to solidify a collection point in Kendall County, and we will include that information in a forthcoming press release. So if you live in Kendall County, be on the lookout for that press release. With that, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon to learn more about axis deer in the hill country. And Matt, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge with us. We're excited to continue to learn from you as you start to put out some more publications. We know there's a lot more to learn, and we just appreciate your sharing all your knowledge with us. Again, everyone, if you want to have access to this presentation again, or would like to share it with friends, family, colleagues, we will be sharing this presentation through the Hill Country Alliance newsletter, which you can sign up for free, hillcountryalliance.org. We'll also be posting it on our social media, as will Texas Tech University's Natural Resources, Department of Natural Resources Management. With that, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Enjoy the beautiful day out there. Thanks.